Welcome back, everybody. I am Andy here with my lovely sister Jen. I know, I forgot for a second who I was.
Where am I? What am I doing? Uh, hello, everyone.
Who's in my head today? Let's just say that. Um, we are on season 3, episode 5. We are just chugging right along here.
We sure are. We sure are.
We've just discussed this, and we're in a bit in awe of the people in the podcast world who can put out full episodes every single week and
I
not go
know.
crazy. I'm not really sure how they do it, because we both work full time and have full families, and I don't really know how they do it. We love it. We're not going to stop or anything. It's just
Right. Um, I'm. It's a win for me if I've got deodorant and a bra on in the morning. I've checked. Both those things have happened, so I'm ready to go.
I don't have deodorant on yet.
Okay. Well, I
I'm going
win.
to be honest. I haven't even showered yet. Let's just throw it right out there. Let's just be completely honest. My hope is to work out later, so I'll shower after that.
There you go.
I am going to go see the new Insidious movie today, so I do have a reason to shower.
Okay. Well, there you go.
I mean, that's
Motivation.
always motivate, right? That's what I'm thinking. I'm going to an actual theater
Good.
with 3, possibly 4 of my children, who are all going to want to sleep with me tonight, even though 3 out of 4 are teenagers.
Hmm.
They're all going to want to sleep in my room tonight. I can feel it.
Exactly.
Little fuckers.
It's gonna happen.
Anyway, so I'll be showered later. So now that we've discussed that,
Right.
um, we have the final episode in our Albert Fish series, and we're going to talk about the famous Grace Budd letter. We're going to read that to you in its entirety,
Okay.
and you might need to make sure you have a place to sit if you're cleaning house or mowing the lawn or something. You might want, while you're listening, you might want to find a place to sit when we get to that part, because it's going
Okay.
to be a little mind blowing. Um, Jen and I were just talking. We're going to try to be funny in parts of this, but it might be a little hard in some spots. But
Right.
we'll deliver it as best we can. So I cannot remember if we have any Google and Beyond. We did from the first Albert Fish or the last Mothman, and we never answered them, and I never wrote it down when I was editing. So those are just in the wind.
Okay. Send us an email if you want your questions answered.
Ah! And we will be glad to forget again.
We will
Not
be.
gonna lie. Um, I would like to say that we haven't gotten enough stories in yet to do a listener episode, and we would really enjoy it if it doesn't matter the size of your story. If you've had any type of paranormal experience, we'd love to hear about it. So please send that in.
For real.
So Ichabod's Nose, pick. What do you got?
I've been binging Father Brown on
Oh, yes.
BritBox.
I can attest to that. She has.
Andy came to visit last week and she witnessed my dirty little secret. So now it's out there. I am addicted to, hi, my name's Jen. I'm addicted to BritBox and I love Father Brown.
Dude, you have got to watch Ghosts.
I know. I told Chris
Did I
that.
tell you what it's about?
Yes.
Okay. So freaking funny. You have to watch it. You'll love it. But not the American version. That's not near as funny.
Right. Got you. All right. So what do you have for Ichabod's Nose?
What do I have for Ichabod's Nose? Can she remember? Well, I did just yesterday, just for fun, while I was folding some clothes. I did watch Rush Hour 2.
Oh gosh, that's an oldie but a goodie,
That's
huh?
a throwback. Yeah, it was so funny. But there's also something that I've been watching on Netflix. Oh, I knew it. I know it. I knew it. I knew it, and I know it. And I'm knowing it tomorrow. The new season of Skinwalker Ranch.
Okay.
OMG.
Okay.
We have to do an episode on that. Or
Okay.
probably 3. at some point. It might not be this season, might be next season, but we have to because, and then the stuff that they're finding now, mind boggling.
That's crazy.
It's so cool because you're seeing it while they're doing it, you know? It's just, it's really, really, it's really cool. So and it's kind of done like the, uh, the island one, you know, with the brothers and the island in Nova Scotia. You know what I'm talking about?
I don't.
Where they believe that the pirates buried that treasure.
I don't know what you're talking about. I don't understand the words that are coming out of your mouth.
Now you're just quoting.
Looks like you've got a Google and Beyond for next week.
All right, listen, I better write this down because otherwise I'm going to forget it. Okay. The island show, you know, everybody out there is shouting at their device right now, saying the name of it. Ask him, ask Thor what it is.
Chris, do you know of a show that takes place in Nova Scotia? A couple of brothers who believe that there's remains of pirates buried there.
Pirate treasure.
Pirate treasure. Remains of pirate treasure. And probably pirates.
I don't know. Yeah.
He doesn't know. His eyes are crossed.
It's on the History Channel, Thor.
It's on the History Channel, she says. He doesn't know. Now he's scared. He ran away.
It's something island.
Okay.
Anyway, I'll find that out.
So far, we've discussed Albert Fish's upbringing in an orphanage, his marriage to his first wife,
Anna,
and we discussed what a wonderful father he was and what a calculating killer and cannibal he turned out to be. I'd also like to point out that Andy's got a lot of shitty errors in her typing this morning. So you're going to just have to bear witness to that as we go along.
normally you're really good at skimming over those errors and you just read it flawlessly. But this one was a doozy.
This one was a doozy.
I don't know what I was doing. And that's in the first paragraph. Lord knows what we're going to find out in the rest of the script.
I can't wait. I can't wait.
Okay, so in this episode, we're going to get into the murder he became famous for. And that's the murder of 10-year-old a 10-year-old girl named Grace Budd. We will also discuss how his sociopathic narcissism was the beginning of the end for him.
So listen up, all you narcissists out there. It never ends well. And people don't like you. If you're a narcissist, most people don't like you. They don't like that kind of business. They don't like that kind of shit. So become self-aware of your issue and work on it so that you can have normal, healthy relationships.
100%. It helps if you take some psychology courses and just discover it yourself, because if somebody tells you you're a narcissist, you're not going to believe them.
Right.
But my husband did that. God love him. And, you know, there you go.
There you go.
There you go.
There you go. All right. It was Monday, May 28th, 1928. Albert Fish called on the Budd resident in tenement housing in New York City. He was answering an ad in the newspaper, and the ad said, "Attention, all cannibals, please come to our tenement. We'd love to see you." On the previous Friday, a short but stocky 18-year-old Budd used all of his money to buy a classified ad in the New York World. It read, oh, here we go. "Young man, 18, wishes position in country. Edward Budd, 406 West 15th Street."
On Sunday morning, his ad ran, and Albert Fish studied it. In fact, he was mesmerized by it.
Ooh.
His deviantly sane mind was thrilled at this new prospect.
So I'm wondering why he didn't just go into mesmerism, young Ed Budd. If
I know.
If he mesmerized Albert Fish.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Anyway, when Delia Budd, who is Edward's mother, answered the door, Albert Fish was all politeness and smiles. He could hardly contain his excitement. But he was a pro, so he didn't love bomb the family right away. No, that would come later. For now, he would impress with subtlety.
Mrs. Budd was already impressed when she answered the door and first saw Fish dressed in a dark suit and black felt hat. In the dim light of the hallway, Mrs. Budd thought that Albert Fish looked quite dapper.
Oh my. So he whisked off his hat, as passion-filled gentlemen do, and bowed slightly. Good day to you. Oh, wait. I think I'm channeling Nixon for this guy.
Mm-hmm.
Good day to you. My name is Frank Howard. I'm here with an offer that might interest your son. It appears that Frank Howard is a much better dresser than Albert Fish.
It's true,
Clearly.
but only slightly better. Mrs. Budd invited him in right away. The windows in the apartment faced the back alley, so even at the height of sunshine, the rooms were still shadowy. Mrs. Budd guided Albert to a chair, offered him a seat and some lemonade, and turned on a lamp.
In the yellow glow, she got a better look at him. Mrs. Budd found it hard to tell his age, but he seemed dried up and shrunken, like one of those wizened old men with whose hollow faces look like parchment-covered skulls.
Isn't that quite the description of him?
Ugh, he looks, it sounds like he just looks cadaverous. He looks
Yes,
like,
yes. I
ugh.
mean, just crazy. She said he had a sharp, beaked nose, watery blue eyes, a thatch of gray hair, and a gray mustache that drooped in the corners of his mouth. His taupe incisors protruded slightly, giving him the look of a kindly old rodent. I wonder if there's a calendar of the month type thing to go with the molester book club. Remember last week we talked about that he had a molester book club, probably.
Probably
And so I
so.
wonder if there's a calendar of the month type thing to go with molesters, you know?
Mm, God, gross. Well, as they sat there, Mrs. Budd noticed that his attire wasn't that dapper, after all. His suit seemed much shabbier than it had when he stood out in the dark hallway. His jacket cuffs were frayed, the pants were worn to a shine at the knees. But shabbiness and hunchback aside, the dude looked respectable. When he raised his left hand to take a drink of his lemonade, a large diamond pinky ring glistened in the lamplight. Whatever doubts she had about the old man were dashed when she saw that ring. Okay, here's my thing. When I see pinky ring,
I know.
I don't say to myself, "My, that gentleman looks respectable." I say to myself a couple of things. Number 1 is ew. Number 2 is douche. So that's what goes through my head.
I think that there are some really cool pinky rings that look good on some guys. I will say that. I have seen, and they don't look like douches.
No,
But I think the majority can look douchey.
nope. Listen, to all our male listeners, if you are considering a pinky ring, don't. Do yourself a favor. Don't. Don't do
Just don't.
it.
Just don't
Don't
do it.
do it. Nope. Any of the other 3 fingers, even the thumb, fine. Pinky, no. No.
Wears a ring on their thumb. I suppose there are people that wear rings on their
There are
thumbs.
plenty of people who wear rings on their thumbs. Do not wear a pinky ring, because if I ever see you in one, you will be mentioned on this podcast, and not kindly.
Okay, well, I think she means it. I'm just saying. And as we all know, she's very intimidating. So take it for what it's worth there, people.
Exactly.
Edward came home with his best friend, Willie Corman, in tow. Willie was another strong teenager with an impressive set of shoulders,
Ooh,
which sounds great if they're going to bale hay, but it just sounds gross when taking it from Albert's perspective, I
for
think.
real.
hmm With his intended target finally in front of him, Albert could start his pitch. He told them he was a businessman by trade, but had done so well, he stopped working and bought a farm, complete with cows, hogs, and chickens.
And he needed help running things since his wife had left him and not one of his 6 children wanted to be involved. Okay, to the family in the tenement. If a wife leaves a man and none of his 6 children want anything to do with him. That's what we call a red flag. Red flag. So it would probably be a bad idea to let any of your children near that man
Mhm.
ever.
But remember, this was pre-Oprah,
I know.
and
I get that.
all in the Depression, and all they saw were the pinky rings. I think Bruno Mars has a song that says something about pinky rings up in the air, and
Gross.
the suit, even though it was worn, it was still a suit. You know?
Ew and douche. Okay.
Yeah, agreed.
One of his boys, Albert Fish, is relaying this information.
Hmm.
One of his boys was a cadet at West Point, he told them. And clearly, there were so many layers to his lies. He could tell that the boys were more than intrigued. I imagine so. If you're hearing, yeah, I got a kid at West Point, these
Hmm.
tenement dwellers are probably like, holy shit, there's life outside these walls, you know?
Hmm.
Also, Albert was clearly a pro when it came to seducing children and young men. He knew just what to say and what to offer.
He really did, because he kept that one boy, for weeks on end. And it wasn't like he had him tied up the whole time. Sometimes he did, but he kept him with, money. I mean, this boy essentially allowed him to beat him and do awful, awful things to him because he was getting paid. And this was a horrible, horrible economic time.
Yeah, it was.
So, people, I mean, I hate to say it, but these parents who I'm sure, were obviously very, very loving, you start to see kind of some money coming your way, you know,
Yeah,
you you start to think, I think not very realistically.
right.
So, um, but yes, he did know how to seduce children and young men, and he knew these boys weren't just poor; they were desperate. So he offered both boys $15 per week for as long as they could stay with him. The boys excitedly agreed. Albert told them to pack the oldest clothes they had, and he'd be back on Friday to get them.
Well, as you can imagine, the boys were elated. Albert would have taken Edward that day if it was just him, but he needed to prepare to handle 2 strapping young men. And plan he did. So did the boys. All that week, they packed and planned and talked about how much money they would earn, how nice it would be out in the country and away from the city. It was going to be grand. Maybe they'd get pinky rings of their own. Who
You
knew?
know what? They they could have even planned a shopping trip.
They could have. I tell you. Albert was excited too, albeit for completely different reasons.
Yes. Ooh. So Friday came and went, and most of Saturday too. And the boys are like, what the hell's going on? Because he hadn't shown back up. Then they finally received word. Mr. Howard, Albert, was caught in New Jersey on business, but would be there Sunday to pick them up. So when he arrived, Mrs. Delia Budd was very happy to see him, and Edward and Willie, though, they were not home. She sent Beatrice, the youngest Budd child, who was 5. She sent Beatrice to get them.
Mm. So Mrs. Budd showed Albert into the living room where he took a seat. There she noticed that his white dress shirt was covered in stains. She started to get a bad feeling. Just then, little Grace Budd, Beatrice and Edward's 10-year-old sister, came into the room. Albert was immediately smitten with her boyish looks. He had brought with him a bunch of fresh cheese and a basket of fresh strawberries from his farm. He had Grace sit on his knee and eat some. All of his attention was on her. Big time love bombing going on. Ew.
Yeah,
Ugh.
yeah. He pulled her onto his lap, and I mean, just really, I don't think that groomers had to try really hard back in this time. I think now parents are on high alert and don't let their kids around people. I think grooming probably takes much longer now, and will, but I think back then, it could be immediate like that.
Mhm.
So yeah, so he's got her on his lap. He's bringing this fresh cheese and strawberries, which they probably haven't had in forever.
I cannot even imagine fresh fruit in the middle of New York City at that
Mhm.
time, you know?
Yeah. And of course he went and bought it, but he put it in containers where it looked like it came from his home.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah. Um, so everyone is noticing his attention is all on Grace. He pulled out a wad of bills that added up to $92. And we know this because he had little Grace count it out. He just pulls out this huge wad of bills and he says, "Count this." And she starts to. But they must have been mostly small bills because it was reported that the stack of cash was so thick she had to use two hands to hold it. So a bunch of, I don't know if it was 92 ones or whatever. But again, these people are just seeing these dollars signs going. I mean, it'd be like if somebody put out, $1 million on our table. I mean, that it was that much of a jump for them.
God, clearly he was trying really hard to establish credibility as a wealthy man and that they could trust him. What with the cash, the pinky ring, and the fresh strawberries and cheese, this guy had it and he was not afraid to flaunt it.
No, he is not. Now, suddenly, after spending some time with Grace, with her sitting on his lap, he then breaks the news to Edward and Willie that he won't be taking them with him today after all. He said he would be back the next day on Monday to pick them up. On this day, he needed to attend a birthday party for his niece.
Oh my God.
Just grab that right out of the air, and that's what his plan is.
And so he wants to attend a birthday party for his niece, and this is the man whose wife had left him and his children don't want anything to do with him.
Correct. And he
And
and he's already had this plan to take Edward and Willie to his farm to work.
and now he's
It's
pivoting and
now
going
this is
for
all had changed. Yep. Hmm.
Okay, so the boys were a little pissed to say the least, but then just to add salt to the wound, he asked if Grace would like to attend the party with him. There would be plenty of children there her age. She could play and eat cake, and they would have a great time. Mrs. Budd was hesitant, but Mr. Budd was like, "It's a party. She never does anything. Let her go and have some fun. Let her go and get killed, honey. Come
Right.
on. Lighten up, sweetheart.
And
Let the
just a,
strange man with the pinky ring take her."
yeah, and just a year before was when little Billy Gaffney, he had taken little Billy Gaffney. So it's not like it wasn't like it shouldn't have been on their, I mean, it should have been on their minds that
hmm
kidnapping was, because, and also kidnapping was very prevalent at this time. We talked about that as well, that people did
hmm
it. Normally the children or the people who were kidnapped weren't hurt, the adults too, because they kidnapped adults too. They weren't hurt, they just wanted money.
hmm
Um, but uh, I just, I can't even imagine what they were going through. The only thing I can think of is that this money and this opportunity for their son was such an overwhelming thought for them, and how much of improvement it would be for them in life, or at least for
hmm
Edward, that that's what they were thinking of, and they didn't want to piss him off, is what I'm thinking. That's the only thing I can think of. So anyway, Delia agreed and dressed her daughter in her nicest dress, her confirmation dress. She put a ribbon in her hair and put on her nice Sunday shoes. Albert gave Mr. and Mrs. Budd the address of the party, and off they went.
Oh my God. Okay, so we need to back up a minute. When Albert arrived at the apartment, we told you he brought fresh cheese and strawberries from his farm. But that morning, when he left his apartment, he also had another bundle. This bundle contained what he called his implements of hell: a meat cleaver, a butcher knife, and a small handsaw. This bundle he left under the watchful eye of a man that had a newspaper stand. He left it with that man, stating that he had too much to carry and needed to store his bundle for safekeeping.
Yeah. So on the way to the train station, Albert and Grace stopped to pick up this bundle. And it was, in a leather, like you'd hold knives, like
hmm
that rolls out, Um, so they stopped by to pick this up. They boarded the train hand in hand, looking like a loving grandfather and granddaughter. When they got to their destination, they got off the train. Albert was so excited and lost in thought with his fantasies about what he was going to do to Grace and what was going to happen that he left his Implements of Hell bundle on the train.
And little Grace Helpful little cutie. Notice this. Oh, Mr. Howard, you forgot your package. She bopped back onto the train, grabbed the bundle, and bounced back off again. On they walked to the location of the supposed birthday party. It was an abandoned house known as Wisteria Cottage in Irvington, New York. We'll hear from Albert himself later on as to what happened when they got to the house.
But what happened after that day is important to discuss as well. For the next 2 years, a team of detectives would work on this case day and night. Unfortunately, they accused two other gray men of the killing, and with Mrs. Budd's positive identification of them both, they both almost went to jail.
Mrs. Budd was a bit frantic. It seems like any gray man that was introduced as a suspect she felt was the man who took Grace. It didn't matter if it actually was or not. And honestly, can we blame her? As a parent, how do you even go on after something like this, let alone having to make a positive identification or an objective one for that matter? It seems like an impossible situation.
Yeah, I don't even know. Did you remember seeing it? I think it was an Alfred Hitchcock movie or show. Maybe it was a Twilight Zone. Maybe it was an Alfred Hitchcock. And this woman was raped.
Yes.
And afterwards, her and her husband are driving, and she's like, "It was that man. It was that man," in a parking garage. And her husband gets out, strangles that guy to death, gets back in the car and drives away, and they drive down the street again. And she's like, "Oh, no, it was him. No, it was him. No, it was him." And she was just frantic. And he's like, "Oh, fuck, I just killed a guy." My
Yes.
wife's a little crazy now.
I think that was Twilight Zone, and I
Was
remember
it
that
Twilight Zone?
episode. Oh my
Yeah.
God.
Wasn't
Yeah.
that just but I can't blame her. And they have proof now, they've done so many experiments with eyewitness accounts. And even though he was in her living room 2 times and she sat there with him in close proximity for a few hours each time, she still identified two men who were the wrong people. And I think she just had to be so desperate. And I
Oh.
think too, they didn't know yet if Grace was dead or not. And so I
Mhm.
think that she was just so freaking desperate to have somebody come forward and say, "Yeah, I did it. And this is what happened. And here she is. She's fine." Because too, they would get letters still, Grace, oh, we have Grace. She's good. We'll let her come play with you, soon or sometime or whatever. So anyway, I just don't know. It would be devastatingly hard. I can't even imagine. So I understand why, she identified them. But also, I didn't put this in here, so I'll just go ahead and say it. When they were accusing these men, and we'll talk about who they accused and everything, they announced it to the papers, like the police. And so now, why the police are so guarded when they have a suspect, because
Yeah.
they announced that they found the killer and that these were the guy, each time, this is the guy, no, this is the guy,
Mhm.
and so then this guy's life is totally ruined. It's like the guy who was a suspected bomber at the Atlanta Olympics.
Mhm. Oh, they ruined his life. Yeah.
Oh, completely ruined his life.
Yeah.
And so I guess obviously some lessons are harder learned, but yeah, I thought, why, as a police group, station, police squad, you know what I'm saying, why would they announce that? I don't know. The first man she identified was Albert Corthell, and Albert clearly was like Christopher is now. Mr. Budd's name is Albert.
Right, there's lots of Alberts.
Lots of Alberts. So anyway, the first man she identified was Albert Corthell. There wasn't enough evidence really to tie him to the crime, so the judge discharged him without a trial. But that was after like a year or two, or almost 2 years of being hounded and followed and all of that. The second suspect, Charles Pope, he went to trial, but when Mrs. Budd got on the stand, she said she had made a mistake, so the case against him was dismissed. But there's an interesting side note to Charles Pope. The poor dude, his wife set him up and said they'd been married for like almost like 40 years or something.
Mm-hmm.
He hadn't lived with her for years, his wife. He was taking care of his elderly sister. I mean, they both were elderly. They both were in their, at this time, elderly was considered in the 60s, 70s, right?
Right.
And a few years before, she had also tried to frame him for another crime.
What a
And
horrible woman.
he got cleared for that. And then now she went down to the police station and said, "Oh, it was my husband," and gave all this information that she had gotten from the papers. And yeah, and they thankfully the cops did their due diligence and figured out that it wasn't him at all. But yeah, can you imagine your ex-wife? She tried to frame him for two crimes.
Jesus.
I know. So thankfully, um, the thankfully Mrs. Budd, because he did actually go to trial because of everything that his wife said. But Mrs. Budd got on the stand and she had already misidentified Albert Corthell. And so now she was nervous because she positively identified Charles Pope in a lineup. But now that she had to go to trial, she was super nervous and she was like, "Yeah, I can't do it. I made a mistake." You know,
Well, good on her for coming clean.
yeah, absolutely.
Well, while all this was going on, Albert Fish was just living it up. He was writing nasty letters to the ladies in the singles section of the paper. He was whipping himself, and he was busy remarrying 3 times. Oh, yeah, he had it going on. He might have overstepped a bit, however, because one of the women that he wrote a letter to turned him in. He was arrested shortly before Thanksgiving in 1930.
He was examined by a social worker who deemed his mental state as questionable and sent him to Bellevue Hospital for a psychiatric observation. He was questioned extensively about the letters, and Albert just said, "It was sort of a habit." The doctor asked Fish how he felt when he wrote the obscene letters, and he said that he didn't have any particular feeling about it, one way or
Hmm.
another.
Interesting. During his stay at the hospital, Fish conducted himself in an orderly and normal manner and was quiet and cooperative. I mean, what more do you want in a patient, am I right? They found no evidence of delusional notions of hallucinatory experiences. They said he might be a sexual pervert. No signs of mental deterioration or dementia. As a result of our psychiatric examination, we are of the opinion that this man at the present time is not insane.
And that is the question throughout this entire thing, is it? Isn't he insane or not insane? You know what? We need to do a little Yeti score on that at the end,
Okay.
if he was insane or not. So remember, this was a full 2 years after the Grace Budd murder. So he was examined for 30 days at Bellevue Hospital by obviously a team of people.
Mm-hmm.
3 years. This was a full 2 years after he murdered Grace Budd, 3 years after he murdered Billy Gaffney, and 5 years after he murdered Francis McDonald. And those are just the ones that we know of, right? We don't.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably a lot more. Although they didn't think that he was insane, Albert did show signs of what we like to call severe perversion and acts that could be considered insane, such as eating someone else's number two as it is being excreted from the body. That to me, maybe people really like that. I think that would be, I mean, you're all in on that perversion right there.
Mm-hmm.
You are all in with both feet there. And if you enjoy that and you are a consenting adult, you know what? More power to you.
Right.
But I do think that that could be classified in the not normal range
I
a little
would
bit.
say that, yeah,
And not to mention, I think that's kind of unhealthy. I think you need to watch your step if you do that.
that's a little to the extreme right of the bell curve there. That's
Mhm. I think so. But maybe there are so many people that do that, it is considered normal in an underground type of situation.
maybe
Maybe they
so.
do have groups that like to, and I don't know, not judging. If you are a consenting adult and want to do that, you go right ahead. But I think that the people that he did it to or with were probably intimidated into it.
Gross.
Yeah.
The first rule of Pervert Club is you don't talk about Pervert Club.
Right.
Okay. So we may never know the entire truth of that
And I'm
because,
good with that. I'm good with having my head in the dark.
yeah. Well, there were other acts that one could consider severe perversions. His son, Albert Jr., reported that when they lived together in 1929, he came home early from work and his father was out. He was in the kitchen and found something in the corner. There were two paddles each almost 2 feet long, with nails protruding from all over one end.
Hmm. Albert Jr.
Mm.
confronted Albert Sr. about this, and at first, Albert Sr. didn't say anything. He was a little embarrassed, a little bit flustered, taken off guard, caught off guard. He then finally admitted that yes, they were his paddles, that he used them on himself, and he went on to explain, sometimes I get feelings that come over me, and every time they do, I have to torture myself with those paddles.
There was the time back in 1922 when Albert Jr., Henry, and Jean were kicking the football around outside. Albert Jr. caught a glimpse of Albert Sr. standing in the apple orchard on a little hill behind their house. He had his right hand raised in the air and was shouting, "I am Christ." So, when he was arrested and institutionalized, Albert Jr. just embarrassed, was not embarrassed, was just embarrassed and not surprised.
Okay, that was not my typing. That was all you.
So I'm going to just kind of break it down for you listeners. Albert Jr. was embarrassed that his father got arrested and institutionalized. He was not surprised.
Yes,
There. Is that
correct.
clear? Okay.
That is clear.
There we go.
There we go.
There we go.
Fantastic. In 1931, 6 months after his release from Bellevue, Albert Sr. was again arrested for sending obscene mail to the proprietor of a local boarding school. He just couldn't help himself. I know I typed boarding school. He just could not help himself. He had to keep writing these letters. They discovered more letters when they searched his room under his mattress. They also found a cat of nine tails and tucked in a dresser drawer, a hot dog and a carrot, both covered with decay and something worse.
Ew. Ew. One of the arresting officers, John P. Smith, picked up the cat o' nine tails and asked Fish what he used it for. "I like to whip myself with it, though I don't suppose it's anyone's goddamn business but my own." Then John P. Smith did something that would probably be the worst, most regrettable thing he ever did in his life. He used his thumb and forefinger and picked up the hot dog, holding it at arm's length. He asked,
And what the hell do you use this for?
"I stick 'em up my ass."
Can you imagine being that cop? Oh
Ugh.
my God. So Fish was obviously sent for another observationary period, this time for only 10 days versus the 30 days he spent the first time at Bellevue. When he was released, he stayed out of trouble for a long time. And here again, that we know of. Just
Mhm.
because he didn't get caught doesn't mean he didn't do anything. I
Right.
find it hard to believe that for the next few years, for 3 whole years, he didn't molest a child, he didn't murder somebody, he didn't write obscene letters. I he was doing this from the word go. From the time he was 12 years old, he was nonstop being a sexual, probably addicted to sex and addicted to out of the norm sex. Some would say deviant, and obviously trying to seduce young children in that, criminal sex
Right.
acts, obviously, and then killing people. I find it very difficult to believe that he was good, quote unquote, good for 3 years. So
Mhm.
that's just my take on it.
Good Lord.
Um, so when he was released after this 10-day stint, he stayed out of trouble for a long time. Albert Jr. was thinking maybe this last stint in the mental hospital worked.
But as life would have it, all good things must come to an end. About 3 years later, in 1934, things started up again. Albert was having night terrors. He was seeing Grace in his dreams saying, "I'll tell Mama."
Yeah, he would wake up soaked in sweat, his heart racing, believing that God was demanding atonement through mortification of flesh. And what exactly does this mean, Jen? Are you
Don't
ready?
know.
Yeah, hang on. Well, for
Okay.
this man of passion, it meant that he would start with gathering some needles.
Okay.
Then he
Okay.
would squat down low, naked, of course.
Okay.
and he would insert said needles up as far as they would go
Okay.
in his taint.
Oh,
He would then masturbate until release. And after he was cleansed and clear headed again, he would be filled with a deep sense of justification.
did he sterilize the needles before he put them up in his taint?
I don't know. He didn't die from it.
Jesus. Okay. Yeah, he totally thought he was justified because Albert believed that he had actually saved Grace Budd from the most ultimate violation, which is sex. And remember, apparently Albert did not violate her. She did die a virgin, and he was very proud of that fact. He truly believed that if he was not supposed to save her, then angels would have interrupted him killing her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Ugh. Okay, so
And
that seems insane to me.
yes, agreed. Agreed. Um, but then also, when they x-rayed him after he was arrested at the end of all this, and I didn't put it in here, but they found 28 needles up in there in his taint region. And
So he walked around. He didn't like stick them up.
and pull them out. No, he stuck them up as far as they would go and he left them in.
Okay. Okay.
And some had been in there so long they were deteriorating, disintegrating. Yeah. It was
Mm.
28 of them. So he thought about Grace all the time now because she was different. He didn't violate her. And the newspapers didn't help. Every time there was an article written about the Bud girl, he would snicker in delight about the misguided reports. He'd cut out the articles and save the clippings. He found out the Buds had moved and he took note of their new address. He thought he might write to Mrs. Budd one day. But that's
Oh,
why she was on his mind all the time, was because it wasn't a normal thing for him. He
right.
normally violated them sexually and he did not do that to her.
Detective William F. King had been working on the case from the beginning, and now, 6 years later, he was seemingly the only detective who was still working the case, let alone who cared about it. He still had some tricks up his sleeve to generate new leads. One of these strategies was to plant a phony news story in the New York City papers.
I really love that you're able to decipher my typos.
You do it for me all the time because I write some pretty weird words.
These stories worked just as planned, generating dozens of new leads every time for Detective King to exhaust. Even though none of these panned out, King felt there was always a chance that someone might come forward with something that might help solve the case. Um, yeah, so he really he worked this case all the
Okay.
time, for all these years. So one such news story read,
I checked on the Grace Budd mystery. She was 8 when she was kidnapped about 6 years ago, and it is safe to tell you that the Department of Missing Persons will break the case, or they expect to, in 4 weeks. They are holding a Koki now at Randall's Island, who is said to know most about the crime. Grace is supposed to have been done away with in Lyme, but another legend is that her skeleton is buried in a local spot. More anon.
I don't know what that means, more anon. What does that mean?
More soon. More
Oh,
coming.
okay. And I don't know what a Koki is. Do you know what a Koki is?
Yeah, they are holding a Koki. That means that they have arrested and they're holding in the jail cell a coke addict.
Oh, okay. Oh, lovely. Well, I didn't know that.
Hmm.
That is such a coincidence. Do you know that Chris watched Chef Ramsay on TikTok? You
Hmm.
know who Chef Ramsay is?
Kind of, yeah.
That guy, I think Hell's Kitchen is what
Yep.
he does.
Hmm.
He went to Columbia and learned how to make cocaine. Listen, people, don't do it. It's made with gasoline. It's made with some sort of acid
Hmm.
and some other kind of poison.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yep.
Yeah,
Don't put
don't do
that shit.
cocaine. Do
Don't put
yeah,
that in your body.
don't do it anywhere. Yeah. Okay, well, sure enough, 10 days after this article was printed, Delia Budd received a letter. Although Delia was functionally illiterate, she could make out her name neatly on the envelope. She sat down and opened the letter, but unfortunately, she had trouble reading it. This was the one time her illiteracy proved to be a blessing.
Her son Edward, the original intended victim of Albert's, was home. She asked him to read the letter. He went down to the kitchen, sat down beside her, and began to read it silently. Almost immediately, the color began to drain from his face. Mrs. Budd stared at him. "What's wrong?" she asked. "What does it say?" But Edward didn't answer. He was already on his way out the door.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay, so you and I are going to take turns reading this. Um, and it goes for quite a few paragraphs. So, anyway, just good luck,
Okay.
Godspeed. This is
Okay.
the actual letter that he wrote to Mrs. Budd. So
Okay.
by 10 a.m. on November 12th, 1934, that letter was in Detective King's hand, and it read, "My dear Mrs. Budd, in 1894, a friend of mine shipped as a deckhand on the steamer Tacoma, Captain John Davis. They sailed from San Francisco for Hong Kong, China. On arriving there, he and two others went ashore and got drunk. When they returned, the boat was gone. At that time, there was famine in China. Meat of any kind was from $1 to $3 a pound. So great was the suffering among the very poor that all children under 12 were sold for food in order to keep others from starving."
A boy or girl under the age of 14 was not safe in the street. You could go in any shop and ask for steak, chops, or stew meat. Part of the naked body of a boy or girl would be brought out, and just what you wanted cut from it. A boy or girl's behind, which is the sweetest part of the body, and sold as veal cutlet, brought the highest price.
John stayed there so long he acquired a taste for human flesh. On his return to New York, he stole two boys, one 7 and one 11. He took them to his home, stripped them naked, and tied them in a closet. Then he burned everything they had on. Several times every day and night, he spanked them, tortured them, to make their meat good and tender.
First, he killed the 11-year-old boy because he had the fattest ass, and of course, the most meat on it. Every part of his body was cooked and eaten, except the head, bones, and guts. He was roasted in the oven, all of his ass, boiled, broiled, fried, and served. This guy's a fucking monster. I hope he was drawn and quartered. The little boy was next. Went the same way. At that time, I was living at 409 East 100th Street, near Right Side. He told me so often how good human flesh was, I made up my mind to taste it.
On Sunday, June 3rd, 1928, I called on you at 406 West 15th Street. Brought you pot cheese, strawberries. We had lunch. Grace sat on my lap and kissed me. I made up my mind to eat her, on the pretense of taking her to a party. You said yes, she could go.
I took her to an empty house in Westchester I had already picked out. When we got there, I told her to remain outside. She picked wildflowers. I went upstairs and stripped all my clothes off. I knew if I did not, I could get her blood on them.
When all was ready, I went to the window and called her. Then I hid in a closet until she was in the room. When she saw me all naked, she began to cry and tried to run down the stairs. I grabbed her, and she said she would tell her mama. You want me to read it? Okay.
Nope, I got it. First, I stripped her naked. How she did kick, bite, and scratch. I choked her to death, then cut her in small pieces so I could take my meat to my rooms, cook it, and eat it. How sweet and tender her little ass was roasted in the oven. It took me 9 days to eat her entire body. I did not fuck her, though. I could have, had I wished. She died a virgin.
So cleansing breath. Yeah. So it's important to note that according to Wikipedia, the story of Captain Davis and the Chinese famine was never corroborated. So that could have been just something that he made up
Mm-hmm.
to, in his mind, to justify what he did.
Mm-hmm.
And his brother, if you remember back to the first episode, his brother had gone to China and told him about savages who were cannibals as well.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Obviously, that's not anything that I ever learned in history class. I have no idea if that's true or not, and I didn't really want to do the research on it to find out. Um, so I don't know if that's true. I think that all of that could just be made up for him to try to justify why
Sure.
he did what he did.
Of course. Yeah. If only I hadn't been told this story, I would have never done the horrible things that I did.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, if only his wife hadn't left him because they had a bargain as married partners. Yeah, he was just fucking fuckhead. But the description in this letter of Grace Budd's death was accurate. However, that could be just another gross crank letter, right? Because, um, I mean, who knows, and I guess not about her death because we didn't know how she died, but about her kidnapping. That was all accurate, but things were published in the paper.
Mm-hmm.
So it could just have been another gross letter. They needed to be sure that this was from the killer because they've already messed up big time 2 times on this.
Right. Like taking a guy actually to trial. I mean,
Yes.
that's no amount of small work, or no
Right.
small amount of work. That's like a big deal.
Yeah, for
Okay, so
sure.
they were in luck because the author of the letter supplied a specific address, 409 East 100th Street, located in the neighborhood where police had concentrated their search in the weeks immediately following the abduction. This address was never made public.
Yes. So that was one little key element there that made them think they had an actual suspect here. Detective King also had a copy of the handwritten note that Frank Howard had sent to the Buds on June 28th, 1928, letting them know he'd be delayed by a day. King placed the two letters side by side and concluded the writing was exactly the same. He said, I don't need a penmanship expert here. I don't need a writing scientist here to tell me this is the same dude. He could tell exactly. Yeah.
Right. Also, on the back flap of the envelope sent to Mrs. Budd, there was a small hexagonal emblem with a circle. On each of the inside corners of the hexagon was a single capital letter, NYPCBA. A two-line address appeared below the emblem. He crossed out the street address but left New York City and didn't even attempt to cross out the emblem. Was Albert just getting careless in his old age? Or was he feeling untouchable? Because after all, he only crossed out the street address. Detective King could still easily make it out. 627 Lexington Avenue.
So remember we were talking about his narcissism, right?
Right.
So he wanted to, I don't know, reach out to her mother and tell her all that he did. I don't I don't know. It was something with his narcissism though has gotten this. And then here he's just not even crossing out. I mean, he just crossed out the dress. He didn't black it out. He didn't go find a blank envelope. He probably would have never been caught had he had not used this envelope because this envelope is key to everything. So when Detective King arrived, he found that the initials stood for New York Private Chauffeurs Benevolent Association. He spoke to the president of the association, Arthur Ennis. Mr. Ennis confirmed that there was not a Frank Howard who had ever belonged with the association. Because listen, chauffeurs are just like us. They're they're not attackers. They're drivers.
They're drivers.
They're just trying to make a buck just like we are.
For real.
Um, King then asked if he could examine all the personnel forms filled out by active and retired members of the organization. Ennis handed over a carton containing nearly 400 membership forms to King. He compared writing from the files to that on the anonymous letter, but was unable to find a match.
God, this guy is going above and beyond
Oh,
because to
yeah,
compare 400
400.
handwriting samples, that's a lot.
Mhm.
The following day, King went back to the NYPCBA headquarters and requested an emergency meeting with all of the members. During the meeting, King reviewed the facts of the Budd case, described who he was searching for, told them about the anonymous letter that had arrived at the Budds' apartment, and he told them about the envelope. King said it was critical if anyone knew anything to come forward. No one was going to be in trouble. They were looking for information, and that was it.
Okay, so after the meeting, this meek and mild guy approached Detective King and introduced himself as Lee Sikowski. He explained that he worked part time for the chauffeur organization as a janitor and errand boy. And he confessed that about 6 months prior, he had stolen just a few sheets of stationery and some envelope from the office, and that was all. Hand to God. That's all he did. Hand to God, he just stole some stationery and envelopes, please.
I didn't eat no kids. I didn't eat no kids. I don't have a pinky ring. I swear to Christ. Hand to God.
He stated he had taken them home to a boarding house he was staying in at the time, and he told King that he ended up using only one or two of the stack of envelopes he took, and the rest he believed he left in his room at the boarding house. But the first boarding house address he gave Detective King was the wrong one. Detective King went there, checked it out. It was not the right one. So he went back to Sikowski and said, "Hey, look, that was a dead end." And he's like, "Oh, wait a minute. Okay, it wasn't that boarding house. It was this one." And that is where we are now.
Okay, so King went immediately to that address and spoke to the landlady, Mrs. Frida Schneider. He showed her one of the old kidnap circulars with its detailed description of Frank Howard. Mrs. Schneider was taken aback. The person sounded very much like one of her boarders, a quiet old man with a gray mustache who had moved into room number 7 just a few days after Lee Sikowski left.
Mrs. Schneider. I wonder if she had a whole key ring thing filled with keys on a belt there. No, I'm
Probably
just thinking
so.
this maybe. Detective King asked to see the register. In his jacket pocket, he carried the unspeakable letter that had been mailed to the Budds on the very day that Mrs. Schneider's boarder had moved out. King compared the handwriting in the ledger to that of the letter. The handwriting matched exactly. King stared at the name in the register: Albert H. Fish.
I don't know how he could even carry that letter in his pocket. I would have such a hard time having that on any. I would be carrying it in a something and holding it like this. I wouldn't even be
Like
able to.
like a hot dog that was stuck up somebody's ass. You just
Yes.
pulled it out that way.
Yeah.
Like ew
Because,
pew.
yeah.
Mhm. No, agreed.
Even though Fish had already moved out to a new boarding house, he was expecting some very important mail at Mrs. Schneider's and would most likely be returning in a few days to collect it. Well, Detective King started a round the clock vigil waiting for Mr. Fish. He was also in contact with the post office and would be alerted to any mail deliveries for Albert Fish.
On a side note here, a letter that Fish had written and mailed the same day as the Bud letter was returned to the NYPCBA because its addressee could not be located. So he just was free willy nilly with all these envelopes. It was written in the same unmistakable handwriting. It read,
Dear Sir, I was formerly a member of the outdoor club, Tacoma Park, Washington, D.C., a nudist group. Business took me away. I have traveled a lot, so joining up my membership in club. I am located here permanently, so wish to know where you have your nudist meetings and the hours. Hoping to be informed, I am very truly James W. Pell.
I just had to include that because I thought, what the hell?
What a twit.
So the same day he writes that horrible, awful, despicable, disgusting letter to Mrs. Budd, then he writes this just trying to figure out where he can go be a nudist.
Mm.
I don't know. But anyway, they couldn't find the person it was addressed to, so thankfully. At this point, there is no absolute proof that Albert Fish is the person who kidnapped Grace Budd. However, if Detective King had any doubts that he was on the trail of anything but a bizarre personality, this note served to discredit them.
Mm.
Finally, on December 4th, the post office called King to tell him that an envelope addressed to Albert H. Fish had just been intercepted at the Grand Central Annex post office. They turned the envelope over to King.
King delivered the envelope to Mrs. Schneider's boarding house with instructions to notify him as soon as Mr. Fish came to pick up his mail. On the afternoon of December 13th, 1934, she called the detective to let him know that Albert Fish had shown up at her rooming house asking about his mail. King told her to stall him, jumped in a squad car, and sped to the uptown address.
Once he got there, Mrs. Schneider led him to one of the furnished rooms where he got the first glimpse of this hollow cheeked old man. King closed the door behind him. Albert Fish? He asked. Albert nodded. As King crossed the room, the old man stuck his right thumb and forefinger into his vest pocket as though reaching for his watch. What he extracted, however, was a razor blade, which he held straight out in front of him.
King grabbed the old man's bony wrist and twisted. The razor blade went flying, and Fish collapsed back into the chair. King was not a dramatic man, not a man of open displays of emotion, but standing there, staring down at the gray old man he had hunted so tirelessly for so long, he couldn't keep a note of triumph out of his voice. "I've got you now," he said. And if he'd been able to, he would have said, "You big fucking fuckface."
Yeah. God.
Oh,
Ugh. Yeah, he's just a gross person. Fish was arrested, and while he pled guilty, he did have to go to trial. He stood trial to see if he was sane or not, because
hmm.
they had to decide where they were going to put him, in prison or an insane asylum. While Fish's defense all agreed, of course, that he was mad, the jury, after an hour of deliberation, I meant to say, found him sane and guilty, and he was sentenced to the electric chair. Though he was unhappy with the sentence, he was thrilled with the notion of being electrocuted to death and even thanked the judge for it.
On January 16th, 1936, the sentence was carried out at Sing Sing. His last words before the switch was pulled were, "I don't even know why I'm here." It took 2 attempts to kill him. Legend has it that the first attempt failed because the device was short-circuited by the many needles
Needles, yep, sorry.
by the many needles that Fish had inserted into his groin over the years, 28 in all. Maybe he just his taint just blew out, just
Wouldn't that have been poetic justice right there?
yeah, like one of the I've seen once. I was out walking the dog one time when we lived in Virginia. It was a really hot day, and as we were walking, one of the transformers on the telephone or the electric poles just blew up, just
Really?
blew right up. And I imagine that's what happened to his taint on the first attempt. That's what I like to imagine because that's what we call karma
Yeah.
and poetic justice.
Karma, biatch.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, just goodness sakes.
Mm-hmm.
The second time, however, took, and Albert Fish died at precisely 11:06 p.m., and he was buried at the prison cemetery. He was 65 years old. So,
Mm.
yeah, that's
Oh
it.
my God.
But we should do a score on whether you think that that he's insane or not. Now, I will say I didn't put a lot in there about him um, talking to the sky or proclaiming that he was Christ or feeling like God was talking to him, but that happened throughout a lot of his adult life as well, that he felt that he was hearing voices right from God telling him to do things or not to do certain things. But I don't know, and nobody talks about drugs here either, that he if he used drugs or not. And I'm not sure. I've heard of people, and I knew somebody when we lived in Nebraska. I knew of a guy, and he was high on meth quite a bit, and he ended up in his front yard in his underwear shouting things at the sky. And so I don't know if that was ever investigated or if that was a thing they ever went down to see maybe if he did drugs. I don't know.
I'm guessing he didn't. I'm guessing he was just crazy.
Yeah.
And I- so so we're going to say 5 is insane and 1
Hmm.
is
Same.
sane.
Hmm.
Um, I think he had some insane acts, but I think he knew right from wrong.
Yeah.
And I think it takes a very cunning individual to go through the amount of um, uh, deceit and manipulation he went through. So I'm going to say, I'm going to give him a 2. And I'm going to say that the electric chair wasn't horrible enough for him.
I agree completely. And I feel that he should have been given to Billy Gaffney's dad and Francis McDonald's dad
Yeah.
and Grace Budd's dad and
Um,
let them carry out the punishment.
yeah. I think that he should have had arms, legs, uh, uh, and head tied to 5 different horses. Um, and then those 5 horses whipped to run in different, or not whipped. I don't mean that. I'm sorry, listeners. Um, Nudged gently to pull in 5 different directions and have him pulled apart. That's what I think should have happened to him.
Yeah.
Um, and then his remains stomped on and then fed to, um, I don't know. I wouldn't even feed his remains to pigs because I think
No.
pigs are good, smart animals. I think maybe lit on fire and then
Yeah.
I don't know what.
Buried way ashes buried way in the earth, so you couldn't even be used to grow grass.
Yep, thrown in a volcano or something.
Yeah.
Just yeah.
Yeah, he was horrible. So, I don't know if you remember in the beginning that, I said that this is the worst one. He's the worst one.
Hmm.
They're all bad, right? They're all horrible. But I still am just flabbergasted that we had never heard of him until just last year.
What is your Yeti score?
Uh, Mine's a 1. I think he was fully sane. I think a lot of the things that he did were to fool others. I mean, he fooled the hospital twice with different psychiatrists. Um, and granted, I think that as a society, and I think as medical professionals, there's a lot more that we know now that we probably didn't know in the 1930s of how deceitful people can be with these um, mental irregularities. That's what I'll say. Like Rocky. He was mentally irregular.
He
You
was
know,
for sure.
but uh, I think he was absolutely sane.
Damn.
Absolutely, because he took very good care of his kids when they were little.
Yeah. It's just
So
messed
I
up.
don't know. Anyway, so there you go. There is the story of Albert Fish. Uh, 2 really good books that we used were Deranged from Harold Schechter, and the other one where they took the notes from his own uh, sessions with the psychiatrist. In Sin, he found salvation. That book, and there's also a documentary about that. So, um,
Gross.
yeah. So if you're interested more so in more details and things like that, which I would just leave it honestly, but if you would, those are some sources that you can use. That's what we used for this.
Gross.
So yeah.
No.
So anyway, thanks for listening.
Yeah, we do want to thank you guys for listening. You make every episode awesome.
Please reach out to us on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook. We love hearing from you guys. And please send us any paranormal stories you have because we would really love to do a listener story or listener episode.
For real. Until next time, remember Ichabod loves you.
Carry a flashlight and always bring extra pants.